Toronto's distillery district had the kind of charm that made visitors lower their guard. Cobblestone streets, restored Victorian warehouses, the smell of roasted coffee mingling with the sweetness of fresh pastries. On that crisp October afternoon, Ethan Carter strolled through the crowd, camera slung loosely around his neck, reminding himself that this trip was supposed to be about healing. It had been years since he dared leave the United States for anything other than work. His therapist had called the vacation a small but necessary leap. He was just beginning to believe it might help. And then he saw her. At first, Ethan thought it was the trick of the light. The sun was sinking low, scattering amber across the brick facades. A couple emerged from a boutique, their laughter carried by the autumn wind. The man was tall, silver-haired, and confident in a perfectly tailored jacket. Ethan's stomach clenched at the sight of him, because recognition struck instantly. It was Vikram Shah, the uncle who had played a central role in his wife's family life years ago. But what truly stopped Ethan in his tracks wasn't Vikram. It was the woman beside him. Her hair was shorter now, styled with the kind of elegance that comes with age and comfort. A blue dress framed her figure, and a pair of sunglasses shielded her eyes. Yet the way she moved, tilting her head when she laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, was so unmistakable it slammed through Ethan like a physical blow. Anaya Rao, the woman he had buried in his heart 8 years earlier, the woman he had mourned, whose ashes he believed had been scattered in India, his wife. The coffee cup in his hand slipped, shattered against the cobblestones, startling a few passers-by. He barely noticed. Every instinct screamed that this couldn't be possible. His rational mind listed explanations. Hallucination, doppelganger, exhaustion. But his heart knew. It was her. Ethan's pulse hammered. His therapist's voice echoed faintly in his head. Ground yourself. Breathe. Identify what's real. But how could he? Reality itself had cracked open in front of him. The couple continued walking, oblivious to the storm inside the man shadowing them. Ethan slipped into the flow of the crowd, trailing just far enough behind to stay unnoticed. His phone trembled in his grip as he opened the camera app, zooming in from across the street. The shutter clicked, capturing the impossible. His wife alive, hand in hand with the man who had once undermined his marriage. He stopped at a street corner, gasping for air. 8 years of grief crashed down on him, reshaping in an instant. All those lonely nights, the therapy sessions, the moments he lit a candle by her photograph. Had it all been for nothing? Had she chosen this life deliberately, abandoning him without a word? Or had something darker unfolded, a deception far more sinister? Ethan forced himself to keep following. His engineer's mind, so accustomed to systems and evidence, snapped into survival mode. He documented everything. Timestamps, locations, photos. He reminded himself this wasn't about emotion now. It was about facts. Facts he desperately needed to make sense of the nightmare. The couple paused at an art gallery entrance. From across the glass, Ethan watched as Anaya leaned toward a painting, listening to Vikram's commentary. She laughed softly, and even through the barrier of the window, Ethan felt the sound slice through him like a blade. He remembered that laugh echoing in their Denver kitchen while she sprinkled spices into a pot of dal. The memory nearly buckled his knees. He couldn't approach them. Not yet. His mind screamed for answers, but instinct told him that rushing forward would ruin any chance of finding the truth. Instead, he tracked their path methodically. Boutique, gallery, then finally a silver luxury car parked discreetly along the curb. He snapped photos as Vikram opened the door and Anaya slid inside, her movements intimate and practiced. The car pulled away, weaving through Toronto traffic. Ethan scrambled into a nearby taxi, giving hurried directions to follow. His driver, used to tourists chasing attractions, asked no questions. From the back seat, Ethan's eyes never left the silver vehicle. The pursuit led them north, away from the bustle of downtown, past the harborfront towers, and into leafy residential streets where homes grew larger, driveways longer and privacy more expensive. Finally, the car turned into a gated driveway of a modern glass-fronted house perched on an incline. The garden lights flicked on automatically as the sun set, illuminating marble steps and manicured hedges. The name on the buzzer plate read, Richard and Shreya Shah. Ethan's stomach twisted. New names. A new life. The car disappeared into the garage. A moment later, silhouettes passed inside the house, her figure unmistakable as she disappeared beyond a curtain. Ethan remained parked half a block away, gripping his phone with white-knuckled hands. Hours later, back in his modest hotel room, he spread his evidence across the bed. Blurry photos, time-stamped notes, the address scrawled hastily on hotel stationery. He pulled up public records on his laptop. The property, purchased under the name Richard Shah, had cost millions. The purchase date? Just 3 years ago. Ethan didn't sleep. His mind replayed the sight of Anaya alive, laughing, hand in hand with Vikram. The grief of 8 years collided with rage and confusion. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would return, he would stand at that front door, and he would demand the truth. For the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan Carter wasn't mourning his wife. He was hunting for her. Before Toronto and the shattering moment on those cobblestones, Ethan Carter's life had been a study in order. In Denver, Colorado, his days were measured by the steady rhythms of code reviews, morning runs, and grocery lists on a fridge that never ran out of coffee or almond milk. His townhouse sat on a quiet street lined with maples and retired couples who waved every evening at 6 p.m. Ethan liked knowing when the trash truck came and which neighbor would shovel first after snow. Predictability soothed him. It was proof the world could be understood if you tracked it closely enough. He had not always lived alone in that carefully arranged space. Years earlier, that same kitchen had been a shared stage, 2 people moving around each other in a practiced choreography, bumping elbows at the stove, laughing at inside jokes as cumin and cardamom warmed the air. Back then, Ethan was still adapting to the bright, generous energy that Anaya Rao brought with her. Music in the background, a string of marigolds on the window, a tendency to start conversations in the doorway because she couldn't keep an idea in her head without saying it out loud. He would open a laptop to find turmeric fingerprints on the trackpad. He'd pretend to grumble and then kiss her temple. They had met far from Denver. Ethan's company had sponsored an exchange semester during his graduate program, a chance to work with a research team in Hyderabad. He arrived with a notebook full of ideas and the kind of clumsy optimism that made cafe owners smile indulgently. The first week, he wandered into a crowded bookstore cafe, sweating from the heat and clutching a phrase book as if it could save him from embarrassment. Anaya was at a nearby table, laptop open, toggling between documents in 3 languages as if switching lanes on a highway. She noticed him squinting at a menu, watched his mouth shape sounds that weren't landing where he thought they were, and came to the rescue with a grin. "You just asked for a bus station with extra milk." Ethan had never believed in immediate recognition. Still, there was something electric in that first conversation. Less lightning, more the click of a well-fitted part. Anaya explained regional idioms with teasing precision. He offered American slang that made her laugh. She was a translator for a consulting firm then, straddling worlds by profession and by personality. He felt steadier beside her, like a compass had shifted to true north. Her family in Pune was traditional in the way families that love hard are. Careful with reputation, careful with money, careful with the boundaries that protect both. But they liked Ethan's unshowy kindness. He was polite, serious, and open to learning. He went to dinner nervous and left full of masala, of stories, of the kind of acceptance that occurs when older people watch a younger person try earnestly. Anaya's mother corrected his pronunciation with a stern smile. Her father asked technical questions about cloud infrastructure. Anaya's uncle, Vikram Shah, came later, brisk and attentive and already assessing. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that said, "I will lead this room." The wedding unfolded like a carefully woven cloth. One ceremony stateside before a registrar, where Ethan's parents cried quietly and posed for photos they would frame above a mantel. Another in India, where a mandap rose like a small temple and a sacred fire glowed while priests recited verses. Ethan couldn't fully understand, but felt steady standing beside. He learned to bow his head at the right moments, to place flowers without knocking over the brass lamp, to breathe in the heady mix of incense and jasmine and something older than his own history. Back in Denver, they built a little world with sensible furniture and mismatched mugs collected from travel. Anaya had a line of spices near the stove, each jar labeled in careful handwriting. Ethan kept cables and adapters in a drawer that he guarded like a dragon. Sundays meant video calls to India, phones angled toward faces, occasionally toward the ceiling when Wi-Fi faltered. Festivals brightened the home. Rows of lamps for a holiday that brought light into corners that didn't need it, but welcomed it anyway. Ethan studied recipes, burned flatbreads, and tried again. Anaya learned to fold pie crust without overworking the dough. They teased each other about sports and cinema, about the merits of quiet versus the insistence of celebration. Of course, harmony has seams. Anaya missed home hardest during holidays when Denver felt too far from Pune's noise and color. She hid the ache with a busy calendar and playlists that ran all afternoon, but sometimes grief for places is heavier than grief for things. Ethan tried to help. Plane tickets when they could afford them, surprise dinners at Indian restaurants that weren't quite right but tried hard. Still, the distance pressed on her like a second gravity, especially when her mother's health began to flicker. Vikram visited Denver twice a year on business trips that came with expensive gifts and opinions he never disguised. He was courteous in the way powerful men are, smooth on the surface with a current underneath. "You must be very logical," he'd say to Ethan, watching him adjust a router or fix a wobbly shelf. "Logic is useful. Culture is stronger." He said it lightly, but Ethan heard the sharpened edge. Around Vikram, Anaya's posture shifted, straighter, more formal. She slipped into Hindi without translating, smiling at Ethan as if to say, "I'll catch you up later." Later didn't always come. The year everything turned. Anaya got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. Her mother needed specialized care, urgently. Anaya moved through the next 48 hours like a woman with a checklist, booking flights, alerting HR at her workplace, packing a suitcase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too often. At the airport, she hugged Ethan a second too long and whispered, "I'll call every day, okay?" "Promise." He nodded and smiled. Because that's what you do when the person you love is moving toward a storm and asks you to pretend the umbrella will be enough. At first, the routine held. Calls came at odd hours, the line sometimes full of hospital beeps and the hum of corridors. Anaya spoke about doctors and medicines and forms. She was tired but steady. Then the calls got shorter, then messages arrived late. Then days slipped by and she apologized with plausible reasons. Time zones, spotty connections, exhaustion. Ethan told himself not to crowd her grief. He kept the house warm, kept his schedule full, and kept a candle burning near a photo from Hyderabad. A moment when everything felt simple. Silence is rarely a single event. It accumulates. One day, a voicemail from Pune police closed the distance with a sentence no one is prepared to hear. A sub-inspector named Menon spoke in careful English about a vehicle incident, about identification by personal effects, about a cremation the family had insisted upon swiftly. He urged Ethan to write down the case number. Ethan did, then forgot to breathe. The days that followed were disjointed, like a film edited by a stranger. He called consulates and embassies and received polite condolences wrapped in procedure. He asked about traveling and fell into a maze of paperwork he wasn't equipped to navigate. He demanded an autopsy and was told the remains could not be examined due to the condition of the body. When he asked why he hadn't been contacted before cremation, another voice explained that a duly notarized power of attorney authorized Vikram Shah to act as next of kin in Ethan's absence. Ethan stared at the wall, phone pressed to his ear, hearing his own pulse louder than the words. Grief has a choreography, too. Friends brought food he couldn't taste. A colleague handled his email outbox. In the living room, a framed photograph grew into a shrine without anyone naming it one. When the memorial service came, Ethan spoke words he had practiced and didn't remember saying. He nodded at people who loved him and went home to a house that held too much air. By winter, he sold it. Moving boxes replaced furniture. He kept the spice jars because they still smelled like dinners that had gone right. He did not become reckless. He became careful in a way that looked like disappearing. Therapy began because someone he trusted insisted on driving him to the first appointment and waiting outside until he returned. Dr. Maya Patel didn't promise clean answers. She offered vocabulary, complicated grief, ambiguous loss, and tools that anchored him when memory tried to flood the present. She said closure was not a door you slam. It's a window you open a little at a time until the air changes. Work kept him upright. A position in Portland. Oregon opened, a promotion with a team that valued quiet competence. He took it, not to flee Denver, but because a new map felt less haunted. The apartment he rented was efficient. Gray couch, white walls, a desk he assembled himself. No clutter, no surprises. The only personal thing on the nightstand was a small framed photo and a candle he lit each morning. Not ritual, maintenance, years folded over themselves. He became the colleague who never missed a deadline and never stayed for one more drink. People liked him. They just didn't know him. He learned to live inside routines that asked nothing back. The jagged edges dulled. He could go hours without remembering, then days without speaking her name aloud. When someone suggested a vacation, he almost laughed. Travel had been the start of everything and the end of everything, but Dr. Patel called the suggestion a low-risk experiment in changing context. A friend in Portland said, "Try Toronto. It's close. It feels international without throwing you into deep water." Ethan booked the flight because booking a flight was something he could control. He told himself it would be museums and quiet walks. A market with good coffee, a hotel where no one knew his history. He packed a small bag. He double-checked his passport. He left the candle on the nightstand and locked the door behind him. The world beyond Portland did not collapse when he crossed a border. It held. He began to think, cautiously, that perhaps his therapist had been right. Sometimes you have to change the view to remember you can move. He did not go looking for miracles. He went looking for proof that he could exist in a different city without losing his balance. And then, on a bright autumn afternoon amidst art galleries and cobblestones, order failed him. A face he knew better than his own stepped out of a boutique, laughing at a joke he could not hear. Beside her, the man whose approval had once set the tone for family gatherings. The past did not knock. It arrived, in present tense, and looked directly at him without seeing him at all. All the careful habits, that morning candle, those neat drawers, the measured breaths, would soon be tested, because the quiet life Ethan had built was never designed to hold the truth of a woman who was supposed to be gone, walking in a city he'd chosen for safety, holding the hand of a man who had signed papers on her behalf. The world could be understood if you tracked it closely enough. Ethan believed that. He had no idea how much tracking he was about to do. Before deception, before grief, there had been wonder. Ethan Carter often looked back at the days in Hyderabad. Not because they were flawless, but because they were alive in a way he never managed to replicate afterward. It started with something small, a borrowed pen. Ethan, newly arrived for his semester abroad, stood in line at a crowded cafe near the university. The menu was scrawled on a chalkboard in rapid Telugu and English, but his nervousness made every word blur. He fumbled with coins, notebook in hand, and muttered clumsy phrases from a tourist guide. That was when a young woman with quick eyes and calm poise leaned over and corrected him gently. "You just asked for a train ticket with sugar," she teased, offering her pen so he could write down the word for tea properly. Her name was Anaya Rao. She worked as a translator for a consulting firm, managing projects that bridged English, Hindi, and Telugu. She had the kind of presence that could shift a room, polite when needed, witty when comfortable, and unafraid of silence. Ethan was struck by the balance she carried. One foot in tradition, the other in a cosmopolitan world that required adaptability. What began as language practice grew into something much deeper. Ethan helped refine her English essays with idioms he had never thought twice about back home. She taught him how certain Hindi phrases carried emotions no English word could capture. Their evenings stretched late into the night, sitting at small tables in teeming cafes, notebooks forgotten as stories of childhood, ambition, and fear spilled between them. Anaya's home life in Pune added another dimension to their story. Her father, a retired accountant, was reserved but warm once trust was earned. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had sharp instincts about people and noticed immediately that Ethan was sincere, if a little awkward. They did not fully understand his background, nor he theirs, but there was patience in the way they bridged the gap. Still, the approval that mattered most came from Vikram Shah, Anaya's influential uncle. He had built a reputation in real estate, carried himself like a man used to closing deals, and expected his voice to carry weight. Vikram did not dismiss Ethan outright, but his gaze lingered too long. His questions carried undercurrents. How stable is software as a career? What future can you offer? Ethan tried to answer honestly, but he sensed that he was being measured on a scale where love alone would never be enough. Yet Anaya pushed forward. When Ethan proposed after a year of long-distance courtship, she said yes with certainty. Her family, cautious at first, softened with time. The wedding planning became a fusion of cultures, legal vows in Denver at a small civil ceremony, and later a vibrant Hindu ceremony in India under the glow of sacred fire. Ethan fumbled through Sanskrit phrases, but his effort drew smiles from elders. For days, he was absorbed into traditions centuries old. Garlands, music, the endless hospitality that blurred the line between guest and family. In Denver, they settled into a modest apartment. What they lacked in luxury, they made up for in energy. The kitchen became their first classroom together. Anaya introduced Ethan to masoor dal and spicy pickles. He taught her how to shape hamburger patties and roast Thanksgiving turkey. She kept Bollywood music playing on weekends, singing along while he nodded in rhythm. He brought her to basketball games, where she cheered louder than he expected, learning the rules faster than he had learned hers. Theirs was not a perfect marriage. No marriage is, but it was real. Ethan's pragmatic nature meshed with Anaya's intuition. He mapped out budgets while she insisted on spontaneous road trips. He measured time in deadlines. She measured it in moments. Friends noticed the way they finished each other's sentences, or how Ethan reached for her hand absent-mindedly during conversations. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, as if both had finally found someone who mirrored what they lacked. But cultural gravity has a way of pulling. Holidays became battlegrounds of longing. When Diwali arrived, Anaya lit lamps in their apartment windows, but her voice cracked when she spoke to her family by phone. Ethan sat beside her, not fully grasping why those lights felt incomplete without the noise of cousins, neighbors, and fireworks echoing in Pune. He tried, but empathy and understanding are not the same. Anaya smiled at his efforts, yet he could sense the shadow of homesickness. Meanwhile, Vikram continued to visit. His presence disrupted their delicate balance. With him, Anaya shifted into a different version of herself. Formal, careful, almost deferential. Conversations in Hindi froze when Ethan entered the room. Lavish gifts, gold bangles for Anaya, premium whiskey for Ethan, felt less like generosity and more like markers of power. Ethan struggled with resentment, but stayed silent, telling himself he was imagining the tension. Those early years were a mix of harmony and subtle fault lines. On good days, Ethan believed they had created a unique space where East and West merged naturally. On bad days, he worried that his world was too small to contain Anaya's longing for family and tradition. Looking back from the vantage point of Toronto years later, Ethan would see those moments differently. The laughter in their kitchen, the warmth of Diwali candles, the arguments that ended with compromise. All of it formed the foundation of a love story. A foundation that, as he would come to learn, was slowly being eroded from the very start. At the time, though, he was certain of one thing: their marriage was strong, their bond unshakable. He could not imagine a future without her, and that belief would make the unraveling all the more devastating. If Ethan Carter had to identify the first crack in his marriage to Anaya, he would not have pointed to late-night arguments or mismatched ambitions. He would have said one name, without hesitation: Vikram Shah. From the moment Ethan first met him in Pune, Vikram radiated a kind of confidence that was more than self-assurance. It was command. He was the kind of man who entered a room and seemed to rearrange its gravity. His real estate empire was known across the region, his reputation tied not just to wealth, but to connections that reached into politics and business alike. Even in casual settings, people deferred to him, waiting for his verdict before they spoke too freely. When Vikram came to Denver, those traits traveled with him. He would arrive at their modest apartment in immaculate suits, luggage that looked more expensive than Ethan's car, and the faint smell of expensive cologne. His gifts were lavish: a gold bracelet for Anaya, a bottle of single malt whiskey for Ethan. Imported silk scarves for neighbors he barely knew. On the surface, these were gestures of generosity, but Ethan couldn't help but feel they were also signals, reminders of who held the power in Anaya's family orbit. Conversations shifted whenever Vikram was present. Anaya, normally warm and relaxed with Ethan, became careful, her posture straighter, her words more formal. She spoke mostly in Hindi during those visits, and though she occasionally translated for Ethan, he noticed gaps, pauses where she summarized entire exchanges into a sentence or two. The intimacy of their bilingual world seemed to vanish when her uncle sat in the room. It wasn't only Anaya who changed. Vikram, in his smooth way, never missed an opportunity to underline Ethan's outsider status. He would chuckle about Ethan's clumsy attempts at Indian cooking. He would remark that while software was a respectable career, it lacked the permanence of land and property. Once, after dinner, he leaned across the table and said, "Ethan, you are a man of logic, yes? Logic is admirable, but families are guided by tradition, not logic." The words were delivered like a proverb, but the message landed like a challenge. Ethan tried to brush these moments aside. He reminded himself that Vikram was from a different world, one where hierarchy was a natural order. Yet the unease grew. The household felt less like his home and more like a stage whenever Vikram visited. Anaya laughed at her uncle's stories, her voice brighter than usual, her eyes shining with the nostalgia of home. Ethan couldn't tell if she was acting or if she truly felt more herself in her uncle's presence. The strain deepened when Vikram began inserting himself into decisions that weren't his to make. During one visit, he suggested that Anaya return to Pune more often to stay close to her roots. Another time, He critiqued the way Ethan handled finances, insisting that gold jewelry was a safer investment than stocks. He offered to manage some savings for them, just as families should. Ethan bristled but said nothing, aware that confrontation would only widen the cultural gap he already struggled to bridge. What unnerved Ethan most were the private conversations that ended abruptly when he entered the room. He would walk in to find Anaya and Vikram speaking softly, only for silence to fall the moment they noticed him. Anaya would smile quickly, change the subject, and Ethan, too polite, too cautious, would let it go. But the unease never left him. He wondered if he was paranoid, if grief for her family and nostalgia for India simply made her lean on Vikram more than usual. Still, a quiet suspicion gnawed at him. There was more beneath those exchanges than he understood. To outsiders, Vikram appeared nothing but charming. Neighbors admired his wealth. Co-workers of Ethan envied the expensive car parked briefly outside their small home. But Ethan felt the weight of something subtler. A man accustomed to control, slipping it into every corner of their lives. It wasn't overt hostility, it was possession, masked as responsibility. Vikram spoke of Anaya as though her well-being was his personal duty. Ethan couldn't decide if he was witnessing affection or ownership. Over time, these visits left scars. Ethan noticed how Anaya's laughter sounded different around her uncle, more restrained yet more eager. He caught her looking at Vikram in moments of nostalgia, eyes wet with the memory of festivals she missed. And when Ethan tried to comfort her during those times, his efforts seemed pale in comparison to the authority her uncle carried effortlessly. Still, Ethan convinced himself that the tension would pass. He told himself their marriage was stronger than the pressure of an extended family figure. He chose silence over confrontation, believing patience would bridge the divide. But silence, he would later realize, often feeds shadows rather than dispels them. When the call eventually came from India about Anaya's mother's illness, Vikram's influence would prove decisive. He framed her return not as a choice but as an obligation, assuring her family that he would handle logistics, finances, and all necessary formalities. Ethan offered to accompany her, but Vikram's voice echoed through the phone. "Your work is too important. Let Anaya be with her family. I will take care of everything here." Ethan had no idea then how prophetic that statement would be, or how deeply Vikram's promise to take care of everything would unravel his life. The call came on a rainy evening in Denver. Anaya's voice on the other end trembled, but not from the crackle of the international line. Her mother in Pune had collapsed during a family gathering, and doctors were blunt. She needed treatment that required both money and constant care. Ethan, still at his desk with half-written code glowing on the screen, immediately said, "I'll come with you." His instinct was simple. If she was in crisis, he should stand beside her. But Anaya shook her head firmly. "Your project is at a critical stage. They're relying on you. I'll go. It's only for a few weeks." The suitcase appeared within hours. Clothes folded with efficiency, medicine packed with precision, gifts for relatives tucked carefully into corners. Vikram Shah's voice joined theirs via speakerphone. Smooth, authoritative, it filled the room as if he were standing beside them. "Ethan, focus on your work. Anaya will be safe here. I'll make sure she has everything she needs." At the airport, Ethan clung to her a little too long, ignoring the impatient shuffle of travelers behind them. Anaya's eyes glistened as she whispered, "Don't worry, I'll call every day." She kissed his cheek, the smell of sandalwood lingering as she disappeared into the crowd. Ethan stood frozen long after she passed through security, staring at the empty space where she had been. The first week offered reassurance. Calls came regularly, sometimes in the middle of Ethan's night, sometimes during his lunch break. Anaya described hospital corridors, the way her mother's health fluctuated, the exhaustion that wrapped around her like a second skin. Ethan listened, offering words of comfort, promising to send more money if needed. He couldn't hold her hand, but at least he could hear her voice. By the third week, small changes crept in. Calls shortened. "Sorry, the doctor is here," she would say, or "I'm too tired tonight." Messages arrived late, excuses written hastily. Ethan told himself it was natural. Caregiving was overwhelming, yet unease stirred beneath his reassurances. When a full day passed without contact, he paced the living room, phone in hand, refreshing apps as if more effort would force a notification to appear. Then came 2 days. 3. A single text. "I'll explain later, don't worry." The silence grew heavier. Ethan tried calling Vikram, but his secretary answered instead. "Mr. Shah is on business in Dubai. Unavailable." The words were polite, the tone final. Then, one Tuesday morning, his phone rang with an unfamiliar Indian number. A measured voice introduced itself as Sub-Inspector Menon from Pune Police. Ethan sat down instinctively, something in the tone warning him of what was coming. "There has been a vehicle accident," Menon said, his English careful. "A woman matching your wife's description did not survive." Ethan's world blurred. The officer continued. The car had gone off an embankment, caught fire. Identification had been possible through jewelry. A gold bracelet engraved with their wedding date, and a U.S. passport recovered at the scene. Ethan's mind latched onto details, desperate for a loophole. "Can I come? Was there an autopsy? Where is she now?" Each question met the same immovable wall. The body was cremated according to family wishes. Arrangements were handled by her uncle, Vikram Shah. He was listed as power of attorney. The words didn't fit together. Cremated, without Ethan's consent? He was her husband. Shouldn't that mean something? But the line stayed steady, the officer unmoved. "The matter is closed, sir. We offer our condolences." When the call ended, Ethan realized the phone was still pressed to his ear. His apartment, once filled with the echo of Anaya's laughter, felt cavernous and foreign. He dropped the device, the dial tone humming against the floor like a cruel reminder. The days that followed blurred into one another. He called the police station again, only to hear different voices confirm the same story. Accident, cremation, case closed. At the American consulate, officials were sympathetic but powerless. "It's difficult once local authorities have completed the file," one said gently. "We can't compel an investigation." Ethan's visa application to travel back was delayed, documents inexplicably missing. Each attempt to push forward collapsed under bureaucracy. It felt as though invisible hands were pushing him away from the truth. Alone in Denver, he clung to fragments. The sound of her voice promising daily calls. The bracelet she had taken with her, now cited as proof of her death. The promise at the airport. "I'll be back in a few weeks." Instead, what returned to him was silence, and a grief that would hollow him for years. It was a gray Tuesday morning in Denver when Ethan Carter's phone jolted him awake. The international code flashing on the screen was one he had come to recognize with both hope and dread. For a split second, he thought it might be Anaya finally returning his unanswered messages. His hand trembled as he swiped to answer. The voice on the other end was not hers. "This is Sub-Inspector Menon from Pune Police Department," the caller said, tone clipped, formal. "Please, sit down. I have difficult news." Ethan's body went cold before the words even landed. "There has been a vehicle accident outside Pune. A woman matching your wife's description was found inside a burned vehicle. She did not survive." The words seemed to bend the air in the room. Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He pressed the phone harder to his ear, convinced he had misheard. The officer continued, his voice flat with the practiced detachment of someone who had delivered such news before. The fire was severe. Identification was confirmed by personal effects. A gold bangle engraved with a wedding date, and her American passport. Local authorities authorized cremation according to Hindu rites. The ashes were entrusted to family. Ethan staggered, lowering himself to the kitchen floor. The words echoed but refused to assemble into sense. Cremation, already, without him. His mind reeled. "Wait," he finally managed to croak. "I'm her husband. Why wasn't I contacted first? Where is she now? Where's the body?" "I'm sorry, sir," Menon replied, his voice heavy with bureaucratic distance. Formalities were overseen by her uncle, Mr. Vikram Shah. He was listed as next of kin with power of attorney. Everything has been completed. There are no suspicious circumstances. The call ended. The silence that followed was unbearable, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator and the ringing in Ethan's ears. He realized his phone had slipped from his hand onto the tile, the line long disconnected. For minutes, or maybe hours, he sat unmoving. Eventually, he forced himself to dial back, desperate for clarification. Another officer answered, repeating the same information. Case number, cause of death, closed file. When Ethan demanded an autopsy report, the reply was curt. Not possible, given the condition of the remains. Cremation has already been performed. He shouted into the receiver, "I'm her husband. You can't just erase me from this." The officer only repeated that legal rights had been exercised by Vikram Shah, who had submitted all necessary documentation. Ethan hung up, heart hammering. He called the American consulate, voice cracking as he relayed what he had been told. A sympathetic staffer confirmed only the basics. Yes, Anaya had arrived in India weeks earlier. Yes, the police had reported her death. Yes, cremation had occurred. Beyond that, they could do nothing. "We understand your pain," the woman said, "but the matter has been officially concluded." The phrase, "officially concluded," landed like a sentence carved in stone. Ethan tried to call Vikram. A receptionist answered coldly, "Mr. Shah is traveling on business in Dubai." No timeline, no promise of a return call. By evening, his apartment felt haunted. Her scarf still hung on the back of a chair. A half-read novel sat on her nightstand, its bookmark frozen mid-chapter. The familiar smell of incense clung to the curtains. Each object screamed that she should still be alive. Yet every official channel told him otherwise. Grief hit him in violent waves. One moment he was sobbing against the kitchen counter, the next, numb and staring at the wall. He lit a candle in front of her photograph, whispering her name as though she might answer. Hours passed in a haze, broken only by his phone buzzing with messages from friends who had heard the news. "We're so sorry. She was wonderful." Their words felt hollow, unreal, as if they were speaking of a stranger. The next day, he phoned Pune police again. Sub-Inspector Menon was unavailable. Another officer repeated the official line with mechanical precision. Accident, burns, cremation, no foul play. Case closed. It felt orchestrated, as though a wall had been built around the truth. Each attempt to pry open a crack only reinforced how sealed it was. Days later, Vikram finally called. His voice was heavy, almost theatrical in its sorrow. "Ethan, my heart breaks as yours does. She was like a daughter to me. Her final weeks were filled with despair after her mother's passing. On that night, she went for a drive alone. The road is dangerous in the rain. We lost her. Nothing could be done." Ethan gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. "Why didn't she call me? Why didn't you? Why was I shut out of everything?" Vikram sighed. "She left instructions. She wanted Hindu rites. I carried them out as she wished. Please, let us honor her memory now. There is no more to say." No more to say. That night, Ethan stood in front of her photo, the flickering candlelight throwing shadows across her smile. He whispered, "This can't be it. It can't." But at that moment, all the doors to answers had been slammed shut. Ethan Carter's first instinct, after the crushing phone call, was to fight back against disbelief with action. He wasn't ready to surrender his wife's story to a single conversation with a police officer thousands of miles away. If Anaya was gone, he needed proof, something tangible to hold, a record to explain why his world had been ripped apart overnight. He began with the Pune police. Again and again, he dialed the station, clinging to the hope that Sub-Inspector Menon could clarify what still didn't make sense. The first call after the initial news was met with a curt acknowledgement. Yes, case number MB 2016-847, vehicle accident, female foreign national, cremation completed. When Ethan pressed for reports, the officer on the line repeated the details as if reading from a script. File is closed. Nothing more can be provided. Closed. The word stung each time. How could something so final be declared without him, her husband, even being consulted? Desperate, he turned to the American consulate in Mumbai. The staff were sympathetic. Voices softened by practice. They explained that yes, Anaya's arrival had been confirmed weeks earlier, but once Indian authorities filed the death report and carried out the cremation, the U.S. had little jurisdiction. "We understand your pain, Mr. Carter," one official said, "but unless new evidence emerges, we cannot intervene. The local process has been completed." Ethan argued until his throat burned. He demanded an autopsy, only to be told the condition of the remains made examination impossible. He insisted on paperwork, but documents trickled in piecemeal, scans of certificates stamped with government seals that looked too tidy, too efficient for such a chaotic tragedy. When he asked about witnesses to the accident, the answers grew vague. No names, no contact details, just references to locals who had assisted at the scene. Then came the revelation that cut deepest. Vikram Shah, the uncle Ethan had always regarded with suspicion, had been granted power of attorney by Anaya before she left Denver. It was this legal instrument, officials said, that had allowed him to act on her behalf, signing consent forms, authorizing cremation, arranging for rituals. Ethan was stunned. He had never even heard her mention such a document. When had she signed it? Why hadn't she told him? He replayed their final days together at the Denver airport. Her hurried packing, the whispered promise to call every day. Was that when she had already chosen to leave him out of the loop? Or had Vikram pressed her into signing something under the guise of family duty? With each call, each official letter, Ethan's sense of helplessness grew. He tried to apply for an emergency visa to travel himself, but obstacles rose like walls. His application bounced back with requests for additional documentation, for notarized proof of marriage already sent twice, for translations of forms that hadn't needed translation before. Each time he corrected one problem, another surfaced. Weeks slipped by. Friends urged him to take a break, to breathe, but he couldn't. His nights blurred into obsessive online searches. How long did it normally take to issue death certificates in India? Could a body be cremated without spousal approval? He read consular guidelines until dawn, his eyes burning. The more he read, the less sense it all made. He even called hospitals in Pune directly, voice cracking as he asked receptionists if a patient named Anaya Rao had been admitted around the time of the accident. Most put him on hold, then returned to say no record found. A few hung up before he finished the question. Everywhere he turned, Vikram's name was present, his signature on forms, his voice on messages relayed second-hand, his authority unquestioned by institutions that treated Ethan, the husband, as a bystander. One evening, after another failed attempt with the visa office, Ethan collapsed into a chair, head in his hands. He realized with horror that it wasn't just his wife who had vanished. It was his agency, his right to act, his ability to claim the life they had built together. Each door he knocked on was locked, and Vikram held the only key. In that moment, grief shifted into something more corrosive, suspicion. He couldn't articulate it fully yet, but the thought took root. What if this wasn't tragedy alone? What if it was something darker, carefully arranged under the cover of official stamps and signatures? Still, without proof, suspicion was all he had, and proof, it seemed, was the one thing he would never be allowed to see. The weeks after Anaya's supposed death bled into months, and those months into years. For Ethan Carter, time no longer moved forward. It simply circled back on itself, dragging him through the same loop of disbelief, rage, and despair. Denver became unbearable. Every corner of their apartment whispered her absence, her scarf on the back of the chair, her handwriting on the spice jars, the faint perfume still clinging to curtains. These weren't keepsakes. They were ghosts. Within 3 months, he put the apartment on the market. Friends protested, saying he might regret it, but Ethan couldn't endure living in a museum of memories. The day he handed over the keys, he walked through the empty rooms one last time. His footsteps echoed against the walls, hollow as his chest. He paused in the kitchen where she had once taught him to grind spices, his hands trembling as he touched the counter. Then he left without looking back. The new apartment was intentionally sterile. White walls, grey sofa, furniture chosen from a catalogue without sentiment. He wanted no reminders, no traces of what he had lost. Yet absence is its own kind of presence. He would come home after work, switch on the television for background noise, and sit in silence, not watching, not listening. Hours passed this way until exhaustion pulled him into restless sleep. Work became his only anchor. As a software engineer, Ethan had always been diligent, but grief sharpened his focus into something mechanical. Code was predictable. Algorithms didn't betray you. His colleagues noticed his precision, but also his silence. He joined meetings, delivered projects, but rarely lingered for casual chatter. Invitations to dinner or drinks were politely declined. "I'm busy," he'd say, though what he really meant was, "I can't bear to pretend I'm fine." Some friends drifted away, unsure how to breach the walls he had built. Others stayed, bringing casseroles and awkward condolences. Ethan appreciated the effort, but their words felt thin. How could anyone understand a grief compounded by questions that would never be answered? Eventually, at the insistence of a co-worker, he sat across from a therapist, Dr. Maya Patel. She was calm, deliberate, a presence steady enough to absorb his silences. She explained concepts Ethan had never heard before. Complicated grief, ambiguous loss. "Closure," she said, "isn't a door you slam shut. It's a window you learn to keep open without freezing." He wanted to scoff at metaphors, but something about her tone made him listen. Still, therapy couldn't erase the nights. He would wake at 3 a.m., the darkness pressing down, convinced he had heard Anaya's voice. Sometimes he reached for his phone, half expecting a message. Each time, the empty screen mocked him. Other nights, he sat by the window with a candle burning beside a framed photo, Anaya smiling in the Denver sunshine, unaware of how fragile their future was. 2 years crawled by this way. He functioned, but he did not live. He avoided holidays entirely, unable to endure the rituals they once shared. He stopped traveling, stopped dreaming, stopped imagining a life beyond survival. Then came an unexpected job offer, a promotion with a company in Portland, Oregon. Senior Systems Architect. The title meant nothing compared to the chance it offered. Escape from Denver. Escape from the streets that still carried echoes of Anaya's laughter. With hesitation, he accepted. Portland became a canvas of muted reinvention. His apartment was minimalist, neutral colors, modern lines, no clutter. The only personal object was the small shrine on his nightstand. Anaya's photo, a candle, and a tiny Ganesh figurine she had once given him. Every morning, he lit the candle for a moment, whispered her name, and blew it out. It was his way of carrying her into the day, even as he tried to lock the rest of her memory behind closed doors. Dr. Patel encouraged him to build small routines. A morning jog, weekly groceries at the same shop, lunch with colleagues once a month. Functioning is not the same as living, she reminded him, but functioning is a start. Ethan nodded, though he rarely believed it. His new co-workers saw him as quiet, dependable, perhaps a little distant. Few knew about his past, and Ethan intended to keep it that way. When conversations turned to family, he deflected with polite answers. It was easier to live as a blank slate than to explain the abyss behind his eyes. Yet beneath the numbness, questions never left. Why had the police refused an autopsy? Why had Vikram been given such sweeping authority? Why had the visa hurdles appeared just when he needed them most? Each question was like a splinter buried deep, small but impossible to ignore. Years passed in this fragile equilibrium. Ethan was not healed, but he was functional. He told himself that was enough. If joy had been stolen, at least he could exist without collapsing. He did not know then that everything he believed settled would be ripped open again, that his careful, numb survival was only the prelude to the most shocking discovery of his life. By the time Ethan Carter had been in Portland, Oregon for 2 years, the city felt less like a fresh start and more like a carefully maintained cocoon. The drizzle that blanketed the streets suited him. Soft gray skies mirrored his muted emotions. Portland's rhythm was quieter than Denver's, and that suited him too. He didn't want energy, he wanted neutrality. A place where life moved steadily enough that no one asked too many questions. His new role as senior systems architect gave him structure. Days blurred into project briefs, architecture diagrams, and endless meetings about system integration. He excelled at it. Colleagues valued his precision, his ability to anticipate bugs before they appeared, his calm in crises. But once laptops closed and people drifted to breweries or food carts, Ethan vanished. He told himself that refusing invitations was safer, that social ties only opened doors for loss. Still, Portland wasn't without its human touch. Lena Brooks, a colleague with a quick wit and little patience for boundaries, sometimes dragged him into conversations over coffee. She teased him for ordering the same plain black every time. "You know, people here experiment with lavender lattes and mushroom brews," she'd laugh. Ethan gave her a half smile and said, "Some systems aren't meant to be modified." It was the closest thing to banter he allowed himself. Therapy with Dr. Maya Patel continued weekly. She never pretended to fix him. Instead, she offered frameworks. "Grief is not something you move past," she reminded him. "It's something you learn to carry differently." Slowly, she nudged him toward small experiments, attending a work social for half an hour, trying a new park for his runs, journaling once a week. Ethan resisted at first, then complied out of habit, then finally admitted, quietly, that sometimes it helped. What he never admitted out loud was how much Anaya's presence still lingered. His apartment was minimalist, intentionally free of clutter, yet one corner betrayed the secret shrine, her framed photo, the Ganesh figurine, and a candle he lit each morning. It was a ritual not of worship, but of survival. Lighting the wick meant acknowledging her absence before the day could begin. Blowing it out meant telling himself he could keep going without her, at least until evening. 4 years into his Portland life, Ethan noticed something shifting. The grief hadn't disappeared. It never would, but its sharp edges had dulled. He could walk through grocery aisles without being ambushed by memories of meals they once cooked together. He could listen to music without flinching at a melody she used to hum. He even began to jog along the waterfront, letting the rhythm of footsteps drown the ache for a few moments. It was Lena who planted the seed of travel. They were eating lunch one afternoon when she said, "You work too much, Carter. When's the last time you left the country?" Ethan frowned. Not since years. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Then go somewhere easy. Toronto, maybe. It's like dipping a toe into international waters without the culture shock. Plus, the food's incredible. She rattled off recommendations. The distillery district, harborfront, the islands. It's a city made for walking and watching. At their next session, Dr. Patel seized on the idea. Travel can be transformative, she said. It disrupts routines in healthy ways. You're ready. Ethan scoffed, but later that night, alone with his laptop, he found himself scrolling through flights. The idea terrified him. The last international trip had destroyed his life. But maybe, just maybe, returning to the act of travel could reclaim some of what was lost. He booked a one-week stay in downtown Toronto, choosing a modest hotel near the bustle of Yonge Street. No detailed itinerary, no grand expectations. Just space to walk, to observe, to exist in a place where nobody knew his history. On the flight north, anxiety gnawed at him. He clenched the armrest during takeoff, whispering a mantra Dr. Patel had taught him, "I can handle discomfort. I can survive uncertainty." Crossing the Canadian border felt like a test. When the customs officer asked, "Purpose of visit?" Ethan forced the word out. "Vacation." The syllables tasted foreign. He hadn't said them in years without bitterness. Toronto welcomed him with crisp autumn air and a skyline framed by the CN Tower. The city was alive with layers. Old brick markets beside gleaming glass towers. Streetcars clattering past, murals splashed across alleyways. That first evening, Ethan walked aimlessly, letting the hum of strangers blur into white noise. For once, he wasn't the man marked by tragedy. He was just another traveler in a sea of faces. Back in his hotel room, he sat by the window overlooking neon-lit streets. For the first time in nearly a decade, he felt a glimmer of something unfamiliar. Not joy, not hope, but possibility. The sense that maybe his life could stretch forward, however tentatively. He didn't know then that within days, that fragile peace would shatter. That the city meant to heal him would instead rip open every scar he had fought to bury. Toronto was supposed to be neutral ground. Ethan Carter had chosen the city precisely because it was unfamiliar, because it carried no echoes of Anaya, no shadows of Denver, no memories of India. For 2 days, that plan held. He explored the waterfront, wandered through crowded markets, and even let himself taste food he couldn't pronounce. Each night he returned to his hotel room, a little surprised that the world hadn't caved in just because he dared to live inside it. On the third day, the fragile balance collapsed. It happened in the distillery district, among the cobblestone streets and refurbished warehouses. Ethan was carrying a paper cup of coffee, camera bag slung across his shoulder, when he noticed a couple stepping out of a boutique. His gaze caught on the man first, tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair cut neatly at the temples. The man's stride carried the same quiet authority Ethan remembered all too well. Vikram Shah. The sight made his chest tighten, but what came next nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Beside Vikram walked a woman in a fitted blue dress, sunglasses perched lightly on her nose. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, styled with elegant precision, but her movements, the slight tilt of her head when she laughed, the graceful way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, were carved into Ethan's memory. Anaya. The cup slipped from his hand, coffee splattering across the cobblestones. Heads turned at the noise, but Ethan didn't notice. His eyes locked on the impossible scene. The woman he had mourned for 8 years, the woman whose ashes he believed had been scattered in India, alive and walking hand in hand with the uncle who had overseen her cremation. 1,000 rationalizations crowded his mind. A look-alike, a hallucination. Stress. Yet when she removed her sunglasses for a moment to glance at a shop window, the truth struck with merciless clarity. It was her, the scar above her eyebrow, the same one he had kissed after a childhood story gone wrong. The same expressive eyes that had once lit up his Denver kitchen. His heart pounded so loudly he thought others might hear it. His therapist's voice echoed in his mind. Ground yourself. Look for facts, not spirals. Ethan forced himself to breathe, pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. He snapped photos from across the square, each click a desperate attempt to anchor reality. The couple strolled casually, unaware of the man shadowing them through the crowd. They entered a boutique. Ethan positioned himself outside, pretending to study his phone, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window. He watched Anaya turn in front of a mirror, holding up a dress, laughing at something Vikram whispered. It was ordinary, intimate, devastating. From there, they moved to an art gallery, wandering hand in hand between exhibits. Ethan followed, documenting everything. His engineer's mind, trained to track data, clicked into overdrive. Timestamps, locations, movements, evidence. The facts mattered. His emotions could wait. By late afternoon, the couple left the gallery and walked toward a sleek silver BMW parked on the curb. Ethan's pulse raced as Vikram opened the passenger door, guiding Anaya inside. He snapped another photo, then flagged down a cab. "Follow that car," he told the driver, voice tight. The chase wound through Toronto's bustling streets before turning north. Traffic thinned as glass towers gave way to leafy neighborhoods. Finally, the BMW slowed in front of an expansive glass-fronted home in Rosedale, its manicured lawn and marble driveway gleaming in the autumn light. The nameplate on the gate read, Richard and Shreya Shah. Ethan felt the world tilt. New names, a new life. He scribbled the address into his notebook, hands trembling, then instructed the cabbie to keep driving. Back at his hotel, he opened his laptop and searched property records. The house had been purchased 3 years earlier for nearly $3 million Canadian dollars. The listed owner, Richard Shah. The name fit Vikram like a disguise chosen for convenience. Sleep was impossible. Ethan spread his evidence across the hotel bed. Blurry photos, notes, public record. He stared at Anaya's face on the screen until dawn, each image tightening the knot in his chest. By morning, he knew he couldn't leave it at surveillance. Answers required confrontation. He rehearsed what he might say, though the words tangled in his mind. "Why?" was all he managed to whisper to the mirror. That afternoon, he returned to the Rosedale house, parking discreetly down the street. Hours ticked by until Vikram's black Mercedes pulled out of the driveway, leaving the house quiet. Ethan waited another half hour, his nerves raw, before approaching. He climbed the marble steps, raised a shaking hand, and rang the bell. The door opened. There she was. Anaya, or whatever name she lived by now, stood framed by the doorway in a cream sweater and jeans, her hair tied loosely back. For a moment, her face carried no recognition. Then her eyes widened, the color drained from her cheeks. "Ethan," she whispered, voice trembling. He swallowed hard, every cell in his body screaming. "You look pretty alive," he said softly, "for someone who's been dead 8 years." Her hand tightened on the doorknob. For a moment, Ethan thought she might slam the door shut. But instead, she swayed against the frame, caught between denial and collapse. And Ethan knew. This was no illusion, no mistake. His wife was alive. The threshold of the Rosedale house felt like the edge of another reality. Ethan Carter stood frozen, facing the woman he had buried in his heart 8 years earlier. For a second, he almost convinced himself this was still a dream, the kind where you wake with a gasp and find relief in the daylight. But Anaya, alive, breathing, visibly shaken, was no apparition. She was real. Her hand clutched the doorframe. "You're mistaken," she said quickly, her voice unsteady. "I don't know you." Ethan stepped forward, jamming his foot against the door as she tried to close it. He pulled his phone from his pocket and, with trembling fingers, opened the gallery. "Don't lie to me," he whispered. The screen lit up with a photo. Anaya and Vikram walking through the distillery district the day before. He held it up for her to see. Her eyes darted to the image, then back to him. Color drained from her face. She exhaled as though something inside her had finally given way. "Please," she murmured. "Come inside. Quickly." The living room was immaculate, all glass walls and minimalist furniture, art that screamed wealth without warmth. Anaya led him in, then kept her distance, perching on the edge of a sofa. She looked older than the memory he had preserved. Lines etched around her eyes, silver strands in her hair. Yet beneath those changes was the same woman whose absence had defined his life. Ethan lowered himself onto the opposite sofa, his body rigid. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence crackled with years of unasked questions. Finally, he managed one word. "Why?" Anaya closed her eyes, as if the question itself cut her. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said softly. "Not like this." "What wasn't?" Ethan demanded. His voice shook with the force of everything he had carried. "Your death, my grief, 8 years of living like a widower." Tears welled in her eyes. "I loved you," she began, then faltered. "But I loved him too. Vikram. It started after our wedding. I know how that sounds, awful, unforgivable. But he understood me in ways you couldn't. My language, my culture, my family. We spent hours talking when you were at work, and She broke off, unable to continue. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. "So what? You had an affair with your uncle." "Distant uncle," she corrected quickly, as if the distinction mattered. "It wasn't planned. It just happened." "And then?" Ethan pressed, his voice hoarse. "What about India? The accident? The ashes? Was that all a lie?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "When my mother died, I fell apart. I couldn't face returning to you while carrying Vikram's child. Yes, I was pregnant. I thought I had no choice. Vikram said there was a way. A woman, unclaimed, who had died in a crash. His contacts in the police made it possible to pass her off as me. He told me it was temporary, that he would explain everything once time had passed. But weeks turned into months, then years, and it became impossible to undo." Ethan's stomach lurched. "So while I was lighting candles for you, mourning you, you were here, living in luxury with him." Her tears spilled over now. "I thought about you every day. I checked your company updates, read your name in conference reports. I even knew you had moved to Portland. I was relieved to see you alive, even if I couldn't reach out." His laugh was sharp, bitter. "Alive? I wasn't alive. I was a shell. I sold our home. I sat in therapy for years, choking on questions I'll never be able to forget. You destroyed me." Anaya rose suddenly, pacing the length of the living room. "You don't understand," she said, almost pleading. "Vikram, he controlled everything. At first it was about protecting me, about securing our future, but soon it became a prison. He arranged new identities, Shreya Shah, Richard Shah, documents, passports, even fake family photos. We couldn't go back. We couldn't admit the fraud. We were trapped in this life." Ethan stood as well, fury coiling in his chest. "Trapped? You had a mansion, cars, wealth bought with a policy on your life. Tell me, Anaya, did you sign that insurance form willingly?" She froze, eyes wide. "How do you know about that?" "Because you just admitted it," he shot back. $2 million. That's what my grief was worth to him. To you." Anaya's voice broke. "I didn't know what I was signing. Vikram said it was just precaution. By the time I realized, it was too late." Ethan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "Too late?" "No, Anaya. It was convenient. For 8 years I lived in hell while you built paradise on stolen money. She turned away, shoulders shaking. I never stopped caring about you, she whispered. Then why didn't you call? He demanded, stepping closer. Why didn't you tell me the truth even once? Her silence was answer enough. The door opened then, breaking the heavy stillness. Ethan's chest tightened as he recognized the footsteps crossing the marble floor. A familiar voice called out in Hindi. Vikram Shah had returned. Ethan braced himself, knowing the confrontation that had been simmering for 8 years was about to ignite. The sound of the front door clicking shut echoed through the pristine Rosedale home like a gunshot. Ethan Carter stiffened where he stood, eyes fixed on the archway. Moments later, Vikram Shah appeared, framed by the doorway with all the composure of a man accustomed to command. His tailored suit was unwrinkled, his silver hair perfectly styled, his wrist weighed down by a gold watch. But when his gaze landed on Ethan, he froze. For a long, tense moment, the two men simply stared at each other. The widower, who had lived 8 years in grief, and the uncle-turned-puppet master, who had rewritten the narrative of an entire family. Finally, Vikram spoke, his voice cool and deliberate. Ethan Carter, I wasn't expecting you here. Ethan stood, fists clenched at his sides. That makes 2 of us, considering I thought my wife was dead. Vikram's eyes flicked toward Anaya, who sat rigid on the sofa, face pale. His words shifted into Hindi, sharp and clipped, but Ethan cut him off. English, he snapped. If you're going to lie, at least let me understand it. Vikram's lips curved into a thin smile. He crossed the room slowly, pouring himself a drink at the bar as though he were welcoming an old acquaintance rather than confronting the man he'd betrayed. He didn't offer Ethan or Anaya anything. You shouldn't have come here, he said at last, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. No, Ethan replied, his voice hard. I should be visiting a grave. Instead, I'm staring at the 2 people who destroyed my life. The smile faded from Vikram's face. Be careful with your accusations. You're in my house, in my country, my rules. Ethan's laugh was harsh, jagged. Your rules. You mean the ones about forging identities and stealing insurance payouts? Those rules. Vikram's eyes narrowed, and for the first time Ethan saw the shadow of danger flicker there. You speak of things you don't understand. You lived your privileged American life while Anaya suffocated in it. She needed someone who could protect her, someone who understood her world. You couldn't provide that. I loved her, Ethan said, his voice trembling now with fury more than pain. And you stole her from me. You didn't protect her. You caged her. You faked her death, made me believe she was gone, and you made her your prisoner. Vikram's jaw tightened. Prisoner. Look around you, Ethan. Does this look like captivity? She has wealth, safety, comfort. Everything you couldn't give her. Comfort? Ethan spat. You bought this life with lies and ashes. You had her cremated on paper while she was standing beside you. You turned me into a widower for profit. For the first time, Vikram's composure cracked. His grip on the glass trembled. He slammed it down on the counter with a sharp crack. You don't know the first thing about survival. You think love is enough. Love is weakness. Control is strength. And I control everything here. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance. Not anymore. I know the truth now. And I'll make sure everyone else does too. The police, the insurers, the courts. Your empire will crumble. The air thickened, heavy with the inevitability of violence. Vikram's hand drifted toward a drawer in the desk across the room. Ethan's instincts screamed. He knew that gesture, knew what it implied. Stop, Ethan barked, his voice carrying the force of desperation. Don't. Vikram's hand paused on the drawer handle. He tilted his head, his smile returning, but colder this time. You think you're ready to fight me? You've lived in grief, Ethan. I've lived in power. Who do you think will win? Before Ethan could respond, Anaya's voice broke the tension. Please, she whispered, standing, her hands trembling. Don't do this. Not again. Both men turned toward her, but her eyes were locked on Vikram. In her face was something Ethan hadn't seen in years. Not love, not loyalty, but raw fear. That fear told Ethan everything. This wasn't just betrayal. This was captivity dressed as devotion. Anaya had been trapped all along. And Ethan realized that the next few minutes would decide whether the truth finally saw daylight, or whether he would vanish, another casualty in Vikram's carefully orchestrated life of lies. The silence in the glass-walled living room was suffocating. Ethan Carter stood rigid, every muscle coiled, as Vikram Shah's hand hovered near the drawer. The air vibrated with unspoken menace. Anaya, pale and trembling, pressed herself against the sofa as if the cushions could swallow her whole. Then, with deliberate slowness, Vikram pulled open the drawer and produced a pistol. It wasn't flashy, compact, utilitarian, but in his hand it radiated lethal authority. He set it atop the polished desk, not pointing it yet, but close enough to seize in an instant. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. "So this is who you are," he said, forcing his voice steady. "Not just a liar, not just a fraud, a man who solves problems with a trigger." Vikram smirked, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the strain. "You don't belong here, Ethan. You're a ghost of a life that ended years ago. If you vanish now, people will believe what they've always believed, that grief finally broke you." Anaya gasped. "Vikram, no." Her voice cracked. She took a step forward, but he shot her a glare so sharp it froze her mid-motion. Ethan raised his hands slightly, palms open. "You won't shoot me. You've spent your whole life controlling situations with money, influence, and lies. Killing me would leave too many questions. You're not a murderer, Vikram. You're a coward." The older man's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "You think you know me." "I know enough," Ethan replied. With careful precision, he slipped his phone from his pocket, keeping his movements slow. "See this? It's recording. Everything we've said, everything you've admitted, it's all backed up. If I disappear, it goes to the police." It was a bluff, but he held the device high enough for Vikram to see the red recording icon glowing on the screen. Vikram's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his mask. The gun remained on the desk, but his fingers drummed against the wood. The control he wore like armor was beginning to crack. Then Anaya broke. With a cry that carried 8 years of pent-up terror, she lunged toward the desk. "Enough!" she shouted, clawing at Vikram's hand as he reached for the pistol. The struggle erupted in seconds. Vikram's strength overpowered hers, but her desperation threw him off balance. The gun clattered against the desk, spinning dangerously close to the edge. Ethan seized his chance. He hurled himself forward, slamming into Vikram with years of rage condensed into one motion. The two men crashed to the floor, grappling, fists and fury colliding. Vikram was older but solid, his body hardened by discipline and arrogance. Ethan was younger but powered by a storm of grief, betrayal, and desperation. The pistol slid under the sofa as the fight raged. Ethan pinned Vikram's arms, pressing him into the carpet, their faces inches apart. "Call the police!" he shouted at Anaya, his breath ragged. But she stood frozen, hands pressed to her face, shaking her head. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't." Vikram laughed bitterly beneath Ethan's grip, a rasping sound that curdled the air. "See? She'll never choose you. She's bound to me. She's as guilty as I am." Ethan stared at Anaya, searching her tear-streaked face. For a fleeting moment, he saw the woman he had once loved, the laughter, the warmth, the partner who had promised him forever. But standing before him now was someone else, fractured, broken, reshaped by years of deceit. Vikram's words weren't entirely wrong. The realization sank into Ethan's bones like ice. He rose shakily, releasing his hold on Vikram, but not his resolve. "You've both stolen enough from me," he said, voice flat. "But this ends tonight." He pulled his phone from his pocket once more and dialed emergency services. When the dispatcher answered, Ethan spoke with unwavering clarity. "This is Ethan Carter. I want to report fraud, false identities, and insurance crimes. The address is 48 Glen Road, Rosedale." Vikram's eyes widened, and for the first time, fear flickered across his face. Anaya sank to the sofa, sobbing, her whispers inaudible over the weight of silence. The sirens would come soon, the lies would unravel, and Ethan knew, whether or not he ever found peace, justice had finally been set in motion. The minutes after Ethan Carter's call stretched like hours. The glass-walled house, once a monument to wealth, had turned into a pressure cooker of dread. Vikram Shah sat slumped on the sofa, his shirt rumpled from the fight, his eyes locked on the floor as if he were already calculating his next move. Shreya, hovered near the window, arms wrapped around herself, whispering fragments Ethan couldn't quite catch. Outside, the faint wail of sirens began to cut through the evening air. With each passing second, they grew louder, more insistent. Ethan stood near the door, his phone still in hand, his body trembling from both adrenaline and exhaustion. When the first cruiser pulled into the marble driveway, red and blue lights splashing across the glass walls, Vikram finally lifted his head. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "You think you've won, Ethan, but men like me don't fall because of a phone call." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe not, but tonight the mask cracks, and once it does, the whole empire goes with it." Uniformed officers entered, their steps heavy on the polished floor. The lead constable spoke firmly, his Canadian accent clipped. "We've received a report of fraud and false identities. Sir, ma'am, we'll need you both to come with us." Vikram straightened, his charm snapping back into place like armor. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm Richard Shah, a respected businessman in this city. My wife and I—" But Ethan cut in, his voice sharp. "Your real name is Vikram Shah. You faked my wife's death in India 8 years ago to cash in a $2 million insurance policy. You've been living here under forged documents ever since." He held up his phone, screen glowing with photos. Anaya and Vikram walking hand in hand in Toronto, laughing in boutiques, slipping into their BMW. The officers exchanged glances, then moved closer. Vikram's smooth facade wavered for the first time. "You don't understand what you're doing," he hissed at Ethan. "You're destroying her too." Anaya turned then, her face streaked with tears. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words landed like stone. "He's telling the truth." Vikram whipped his head toward her, eyes blazing. "Shreya, no," she cried, cutting him off. "Enough. I can't live like this anymore. 8 years of lies, of hiding, of pretending I'm someone else. It's killing me." She faced the officers, her hands trembling. "My name is Anaya Rao. I was declared dead in Pune in 2016, but I wasn't. He made it happen." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Vikram had no words. The officers moved quickly, one reciting rites while another secured his wrists with cuffs. Vikram didn't fight, but his eyes never left Ethan, burning with unspoken threats. Anaya, too, was escorted out, though her movements were hesitant, as if each step pulled her further from the illusion she'd clung to for nearly a decade. Ethan followed them outside. The night air hit him like a wave, crisp and cool. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, murmuring, their faces illuminated by flashing lights. For once, the spectacle wasn't his burden alone. The truth was laid bare for all to see. As Vikram was guided into the back of a cruiser, he leaned close to one of the officers, his voice low but audible. "This isn't over." Ethan stood tall, shoulders squared. "Yes, it is." the doors shut with a heavy thud. When the cars pulled away, the street slowly emptied, leaving only silence and the faint scent of exhaust. Ethan remained rooted on the driveway, his body finally sagging as the adrenaline drained from him. Inside, the house stood hollow, stripped of its power now that its owners were gone. Ethan stepped back inside one last time. The expensive artwork, the gleaming marble, the perfectly arranged furniture, all of it felt meaningless. A gilded cage built on deceit. He whispered into the emptiness, not to Anaya, not to Vikram, but to himself. It's over. But as he stood there, Ethan knew the collapse of lies was only the beginning. Investigations would follow, trials, endless questions. He would have to retell his story 100 times. Yet for the first time in 8 years, the weight pressing on his chest had lifted. The ghosts that had haunted him were no longer illusions. They were criminals, unmasked at last. And though his heart still carried scars, it also carried something new. Space. Space for a life that was finally, painfully, his again. The weeks after that night in Toronto unfolded like a long exhale, one Ethan Carter had been holding for 8 years. Police statements, lawyer interviews, and consular paperwork consumed his days. Each retelling of the story was painful, but also liberating. Every repetition chipped away at the silence that had imprisoned him for so long. The investigation stretched across borders. Canadian authorities collaborated with officials in India and the United States. Documents emerged. Forged passports, falsified death certificates, financial transfers laundered through shell companies. The threads of Vikram Shah's empire, once woven so tightly, began to unravel stitch by stitch. The insurance company filed charges almost immediately. Fraud on an international scale drew headlines, though reporters never mentioned Ethan by name. He preferred it that way. He had lived enough years as a public tragedy. 6 months later, the courtroom in Toronto was packed. Vikram, once so immaculate, appeared smaller in his tailored suit, the sheen of wealth no longer masking the cracks in his authority. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Testimonies from corrupt officials in Pune, bank records of the insurance payout, even Anaya's confession. When the sentence was read, 12 years in prison for fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Ethan felt no triumph, just a quiet, exhausted relief. The man who had stolen nearly a decade of his life was finally caged by something stronger than lies. Anaya, too, faced consequences. The court recognized her cooperation and the years of control she had endured, but complicity could not be ignored. She was sentenced to 5 years with the possibility of early release after 3. On the day she was taken into custody, she turned to Ethan, eyes swollen with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan's reply was steady, his voice no longer shaking. "So am I, but sorry doesn't bring back the years." He never visited her again. Back in Portland, Ethan returned to his routine. Therapy sessions with Dr. Patel took on a different tone now. She listened as he described the trial, the verdict, the strange hollowness of justice. "It's normal to feel empty," she told him. "Grief leaves scars, even when truth finally comes to light, but emptiness can also be space, a place for new beginnings." Her words stayed with him. Slowly, he began to test them. He accepted invitations from colleagues, let himself laugh at jokes without guilt. He started hiking along Oregon's coastal trails, the crash of waves reminding him that life, like the tide, always returned. One evening, he packed away the shrine, the photo of Anaya, the Ganesh figurine, the candle. They had been anchors when he was adrift, but now they felt like weights. He placed them carefully in a box, not to erase her, but to free himself. As spring unfurled, Ethan stood on his apartment balcony, the city lights glittering below. For the first time in nearly a decade, he wasn't carrying a secret or living in someone else's shadow. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. The woman he loved had indeed died, not in a car crash, not in flames, but in the slow erosion of trust and truth. What remained was Ethan himself, scarred but alive, with a blank page ahead. He inhaled deeply, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. A new life, built not on lies or grief, but on truth. His own truth, and this time he was ready to live it.